Hey there everybody, Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another edition of one of our rant series. Today's rant is actually brought to us by one of our viewers. It's actually a pretty good one, and it's all about those magical singer guitar player duos. Okay, so we probably right now you're thinking, oh yeah, there's been a lot of those, right? So in other words, where the lead singer of a band and the lead guitarist, not always the lead guitarist, sometimes the rhythm guitar player, but more often than not the lead guitarist, are these two larger-than-life figures that actually kind of team up to make that band even more popular than it might have been just from the music alone. So again, it's a lot of the image, okay, a lot of the history behind the band, the things they do on stage and off the stage. In some cases, they're songwriting partners. But more often than not, you've got this mercurial lead singer out front. And I'm specifically talking about guys who basically just sung. They were the frontmen sitting at the microphone. Okay, and then you've got this guitar player who in some cases might be an amazing, influential guitarist or just like a sexy guitar god or what have you, whatever it might be. But those duos, those pairs, those magical 1-2 punches that so many classic bands had throughout the history of rock and roll. So some of the ones I'm going to talk to are fairly obvious. Hopefully I've unearthed some that you may not have thought of before, but like think, oh yeah, those two are really good together, that sort of thing. And the eras that these are going to go through, obviously, are going to go back to like the 60s up to more present time. So if I forget a couple along the way, forgive me. I'm not going to get them all, but these are some of the more notable ones that I thought about and some of the reasons why they were so great or why we think they're so great. So I'm going to go way back first to a time like the late 60s, mid-60s. I'll start in the mid-60s. Go throughout that whole magical era of the late 60s into the 70s where we saw a lot of this. This was like commonplace. One of the first that I think of, there's like two that come to mind, probably the earliest versions of this whole theme, is Mick Jagger, Keith Richards. So here you had the first probably instance of this sort of thing we're talking about. So you had Mick Jagger, probably one of the best frontmen in rock and roll history, and Keith Richards, his perfect counterpart, though somewhat of a lead guitar player, but there have been lead guitarists that have come into the Stones throughout the years who never really had that kind of it factor. Playing-wise, maybe, but there was something about Keith and Mick together that just made pure magic. Mick out front, dancing, jumping all over the place. Just, he had that look, right? And that charisma. And then you got Keith, the mysterious guy, always at his side, playing all the riffs, a lot of the lead work. The two of them kind of co-wrote a lot of those classic Stone songs. And then all the stuff that went on off stage. So while Keith could never seem to do anything right off stage and always getting into trouble, Mick, early on maybe, got into a bit of trouble himself, but tried to stay out of all the crazy stuff that happened with Keith, especially after like the early 70s, with Keith just couldn't stay out of trouble to save his life. I think Mick really tried to kind of go on a straighter arrow, at least as far as like the public eye was seeing and hearing. So that was like one of the first instances. And you watch any classic, even to this day, any live footage of the Stones and Ron Wood to an extent, but it's Keith and Mick out front that get all the attention still to this day. So 50 years we're talking about Rolling Stones, and it just never changed. Another band from early on that had that similar dynamic was The Who. So you've got Roger Daltrey, Pete Townsend. So here a little bit different. These guys didn't write a lot of stuff together, especially early on. It was more of Pete's songs, and he needed that guy out front who can make those songs come to life. And there you had, bare-chested and barrel-chested Roger Daltrey with the curly flowing locks out there belting them out, and Keith doing the windmill guitars and playing all the riffs. And they were just, as much as The Who were a four-piece, four dynamic individuals, and if you could arguably say that Keith Moon was just as noteworthy as far as like personality and a character as all the rest of the band. Throughout their history, and I'm talking even after Keith passed away, it was always Daltrey and Townsend kind of made up that 1-2 punch. And especially after Keith Moon died, most of the dialogue with the public and the media was done by those two. Again, that's another very important aspect of this. Who were the guys who really communicated with the media and the press? And in most instances, it's usually the guitar player and or the singer are both together. So you had those two. I'm not going to choose the Beatles here because the Beatles didn't really have a one guy who was the singer. You had basically all of them took turns, but mostly McCartney and Lennon, both songwriters, both guitar and bass. So I'm not including the Beatles, and in fact, I'm not including any singers who also maybe play guitar as well as bass or keyboards or drums or what have you. I'm talking about a guy who basically sat up there and 98% of the time just sang, was a frontman. Okay, so who else we got on this list? Another pretty obvious choice is Steve Tyler and Joe Perry from Aerosmith. Probably one of the ones that comes up first for a lot of people. I mean, these guys were, the Toxic Twins. When it came to Aerosmith, you always thought about Tyler and Perry first. These guys got into a lot of trouble together and separately, and there's just so much history, so many legendary stories about these two guys, and they co-wrote a lot of the music. It's arguable whether Brad Whitford was the true lead guitar player of Aerosmith. I know they both shared a lot of that. Or who was the better guitar player? That's arguable, right? But it was Joe Perry who had the charisma. He was that true character in that band, and his perfect foil, of course, all throughout their history, still to this day, is Steven Tyler. Two bad boys, right? That's what makes it kind of cool, too. You gotta have the bad boys of rock and roll. That's what's instantly likable for most of us. I think we all love anti-heroes, and I think some of those rock stars that had those tendencies we just love, because it's I think a lot of us deep down inside just love to witness like train wrecks. And a lot of these guys throughout their history, throughout their lives, that's what it was like looking at. A lot of these rock stars with faults and all. They're just normal people like us, but faults and all, we love them, right? Who else we got on this list? Okay, Robert Plant, Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin. Another perfect example. That legendary vocal god in Plant. Plant was larger than life, folks. Stood up there, he's tall, long blonde hair, shirt open, belting him out. You get that bluesy voice. And then there's Page. All mysterious, hair in the eyes, playing his Les Paul guitar, just mystically dancing around the stage, playing all sorts of different styles and things. The both of them wrote a ton of songs together. And I think Zeppelin always had this mystique anyway, which was heightened by having these two guys out in front of the stage. Just a legendary duo. Again, perfect example of what we're talking about here. Frontman, singer, guitar player. Superstars, both of them. Forever will be. What else we got here? Oh, how about Freddie Mercury and Brian May? I think that fits too. I don't think that Brian May ever really wanted to be that kind of spotlight guy, which I think he always leaned on Freddie to be that for the band Queen. Freddie was totally that guy. A total character. He was like one of the best frontmen ever in rock. But I think, like, especially on stage, not so much off stage. Here's an example of on stage, Brian May was that guy. Off stage, you very rarely heard about what was going on with Brian May. Kept very quiet, stayed out of trouble, stayed out of the limelight. Freddie was the guy who wanted to be that like kind of Hollywood, larger-than-life figure on and off the stage. But on a concert stage, the two of them, that was kind of Queen, right? Certainly. What else we got here? How about Jeff Beck and Rod Stewart? Okay. We're going way back now. So they actually did not play together in a band for that long. We're talking, what, maybe 2 years? The original Jeff Beck group? And at the time, Rod Stewart was not the Rod Stewart that we knew from the Faces very shortly thereafter in his solo career. Rod Stewart had a big complex early on about performing on stage. There are stories, and in fact, if you read Rod Stewart's autobiography, he talks about how, like in the early days of the Jeff Beck group, he could barely face the audience. But that voice, amazing. And he would slowly start to develop that stage persona, because Beck, at the time, he was like the kingpin. Beck was totally happening. He was considered one of the greatest guitarists on the planet, almost on par with Hendrix. You know, when Hendrix came along, that kind of like knocked Beck and Page and Clapton almost down a notch. These guys were riding high at the time, and then Hendrix came along. But Beck was still this kind of, larger-than-life character, doing all sorts of cool stuff on the guitar, and he found a perfect foil for his guitar skills in Stewart. Unfortunately, like I said, that relationship didn't last too long. It's a real shame when you think about it. If that band would have stayed together, the original Jeff Beck group with Stewart and Beck, and done a few more albums, gone on, and I mentioned in my other show, if they would have played Woodstock, they were actually asked to play Woodstock. They were seriously considered for Woodstock. They wound up not playing. Just imagine what that would have done for their career, and especially those two guys. As it turns out, Stewart did fine for himself. He joined the Faces and, made a great name for himself. And then, of course, solo. He never looked back from there. But it's interesting to think what could have been for those two guys right there. All right, who else we got here? I'm trying to keep this all in the same era here. How about Ian Gillan and Ritchie Blackmore? This is a little bit of a different situation right here. So here you had the dark, mysterious, virtuoso Blackmore, who maybe didn't say a lot, but his actions certainly drew a lot of attention. Then you had Ian Gillan, this kind of comical, happy-go-lucky party animal guy with the hair down to here, and he was the guy who said all the stuff in Deep Purple. He did all the talking. But behind the scenes, these two guys just did not get along at all. And it made for a fiery atmosphere on stage between them. Legendary. Okay, here you have these two guys who, for all intents and purposes, hated each other. But both, incredible singer, incredible guitar player, made magic on stage together. Off stage, they'd want no part of each other. And throughout the history of Deep Purple, the numerous times that they've broken up and gotten back together, they always try to make it work, these two. But in the end, after a short period of time, it was just proven that they are just destined never to get along. But together, on stage especially, magic, right? Total magic. Who else we got here? How about Angus Young with both Bon Scott and Brian Johnson? Angus, always the focal point of AC/DC. Always. Always will be. But he had that kind of out-of-control foil in Bon Scott early on. After he passed away, then all of a sudden, who's Brian Johnson? Okay? You went to see an AC/DC show. Those are the two guys on stage you watched, right? Malcolm to an extent as well. I think Malcolm is probably one of the most underrated performers of any band ever. The nuts and bolts of the glue that put AC/DC together. But it was those two guys. That's who you saw on the cover of Hit Parade and Cream magazine and Rolling Stone. One or the other, right? Ozzy Osbourne, okay? Ozzy's been able to hook up with a lot of guys who kind of fit this mold here. First and foremost, Tony Iommi, okay? Ozzy and Tony, the figureheads of Black Sabbath for ages. And then Ozzy leaves Sabbath, and who does he hook up with? A young Randy Rhoads. There was something magical about Randy Rhoads. The gifted fingers, right? Incredible guitar player. He had the look, blonde hair, short and skinny. Their brief time together before Randy passed away, the two of them on stage, it just revitalized Ozzy's career. Okay, hooking up with this kid. And they made great music together on stage. I had the first band I ever saw when I was 15 years old. Was that band. Standing right there looking at Randy Rhoads on stage and Ozzy. And they worked magic together on stage. And they got along really well off stage. And, Ozzy later went on to try to emulate that whole kind of atmosphere with Jakey Lee. But probably more importantly, with Zakk Wylde, that's the next time where he really had that kind of relationship that to the public, those were the two guys, Ozzy and Zakk. So Ozzy's had the opportunity to do this more than a few times in his career. How about David Coverdale and John Sykes? Another example of a really, really cool dynamite duo that just burned out really quick, but could have been, should have been enormous for years and years and years. So they basically, Whitesnake was always a two-guitar band throughout its early history until Sykes came on board, and then Coverdale realized what a young guitar stud he had in Sykes. I mean, Sykes had it all. He had that black Les Paul, killer guitar skills. He had the look, long curly blonde hair. He could write. He could also sing. Together they made that, they worked on Slide It In together, but then they made that monumental 1987 album together. Biggest selling album of their career, one of the biggest selling albums of the 80s. did some touring before that and drew huge crowds all over the place. But before you knew it, you blinked and it was over with. But that was a pairing right there. That could have been one of the greatest lead singer, lead guitar special duos of the 80s if it would have lasted. It's a really shame it didn't. What else I got on my bag of tricks here? How about Neil Schon and Steve Perry? Kind of, maybe you don't think about that too often, but that was another really good, again, a mega band that had a million hits, toured the world many times over. Who did you always look at that band? You had Steve Perry with the angelic, wonderful soaring vocals, and the dynamite lead guitar player who just spewing piss and vinegar from those fingers all the time. Perfect solos, perfect riffs. Those are the two guys you watched. Perry, just all the women loved him. Schon, all the guitar players wanted to watch him. Okay, good combo right there. Who else? Here's one. This is a perfect example of one. Again, very indicative of the time where we had a lot of this. But how about David Bowie and Mick Ronson? Kind of alike appearance-wise. They fit so well during that whole Ziggy era, those couple albums they did right around in the early 70s, with the makeup and the kind of rooster-teased hair and the platform boots. And on stage, they were just in sync with each other. They wrote a lot of those songs together. Like I said, you read all the rock magazines of the day. When I was a kid, if you opened up Hit Parade or Cream or Rolling Stone magazine or any of the other million magazines that were out at the time, who did you see on the cover in the pinups in the middle? Bowie and Ronson. They were package deal, right? Didn't last too long, unfortunately. Or would that whole partnership last? About 4 years, roughly, something like that? It's a shame. Good stuff. Sammy Hagar and Ronnie Montrose. Another really good partnership of this ilk that was dynamite for the short time that it lasted. Here you had this young singer, Sammy Hagar, who had that voice, had that stage presence. And then you got Ronnie Montrose. They put out that debut album. I still listen to that album. I'm thinking, man, what a band that was. And those two guys just drove those songs, those riffs, those guitar solos, that voice. Didn't last too long, though, unfortunately. What else we got here? Paul Rodgers and Mr. Kosloff. Okay. That's another perfect example of something really early on. So here you have these young guys. Okay. Rodgers and Kosloff, guitar player, singer extraordinaire. This band Free, doing this British blues rock. Awesome stuff. And Rodgers will go on to become such a performer throughout his career, a great singer. But it was that band Free where he really, the two of them, that's what you went to see. Free. You wanted to hear and see Rodgers on stage, and you wanted to see Kosloff doing his thing. Just a great, great duo. Who else am I missing here? How about the Wilson sisters in Heart? Okay, Ann and Nancy Wilson. Another perfect example. So here you have, Nancy wasn't the lead guitar player in that band, although she did some leads here and there, but she mostly did rhythms and a lot of the acoustic stuff. But her paired up with her sister, I mean, what other bands, like hard rock bands, did you see two sisters just killing it on stage? One of the best vocalists of her era or any era, still to this day, an amazing singer. And then the really great guitar skills, even though not in a lead guitar player format, of Nancy Wilson. Ann and Nancy. I mean, it's just a perfect, and visually too. Come on. That Heart was their band. They were Heart. If you saw an interview or read an interview or saw something on TV or whatever, they talked, one of the two of them, that's who they would talk to. That's who you'd hear from. If you saw a poster of Heart, you'd see the Wilson sisters. Of course, right? Oh, how about Van Halen. David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen. Later, Sammy Hagar. Again, those were the two focal points. On stage, off stage. Doesn't get much better than that. That's what you're looking for in a dynamite young band when Van Halen burst on the scene. Whatever you think of David Lee Roth's vocal skills at the time, he had that stage presence. He was dynamic. He was charismatic. The chicks loved him. Eddie doing all this crazy new stuff on guitar. That's what I'm talking about right there. More recent times. How about love him or hate him? I don't like them, but these guys are the perfect embodiment of what I'm talking about. Axl Rose and Slash of Guns N' Roses. It doesn't get much better than that. These were the guys, and you know that they loved a lot of these artists that we're talking about here. So when Guns N' Roses burst on the scene in the late 80s, you had it. Yeah, the rest of the band kind of helped put it all together, but Guns N' Roses was and is Axl Rose and Slash. Whether you love them or hate them, like I said, they make that band. And that band is not that band unless those two guys are together. That's just the way it is. And, I mean, Axl is this loudmouth, maybe not as much anymore, this loudmouth, unpredictable, wild guy. And then you got Slash with the sunglasses and the hat and the cigarette playing his Les Paul. Maybe doesn't say much, but he's the guy who makes it happen on stage. He's the one you hear all the stories about, all his demons and all that kind of stuff. And the two of them rarely seem to get along, but together they made that magical music. And they made that magical concert experience happen. So, another one, maybe something from the 80s. How about Ronnie James Dio and Vivian Campbell? For that matter, how about Ronnie James Dio and Ritchie Blackmore? Okay, that's some magic right there. I think that Dio with Rainbow, that was the start of Ronnie's ascent into the upper echelon. But it wasn't until Dio hit Sabbath, and then later on his own with the band Dio, did you really start to see like the Dio was looked at as that guy. I think vocally, yes. But I think that whole Dio, and especially when the Dio band first started, you had Vivian and Ronnie, and Vivian was this up-and-coming hotshot Irish guitar player, and the two of them brought that band Dio to like ridiculous heights. So, but I think Dio arguably had it with a couple guys, which is really cool. How about Michael Schenker and Phil Mogg from UFO? See, with that band, a little bit different with that band, because I think that Pete Way also was a big focal point of that band. But still, it's like most people, you came to hear Mogg's vocals and see Michael Schenker play guitar. I think I got all the ones that I had kind of written down here. I want to make sure I'm not forgetting anything here. And again, some are probably going to come up and you're going to be like, oh, you forgot this, you forgot this. Oh, one more. Maybe to a lesser degree, but I think Europe, Joey Tempest and John Norum. Another, again, Europe, that's the guys you think of. Joey Tempest, incredible vocalist, good-looking guy. John Norum, who all the guitar players love. That's what you went to see Europe for. You bought a Europe album. You wanted to hear those great Joey Tempest vocals and hear that blistering guitar work from Norum. So anyway, I think you get the gist of what we're talking about here, and it's been kind of cool to revisit some of these great vocalist guitar player teams. Not all bands had it, and I specifically didn't talk about some of the great vocalists in the history of rock and hard rock and metal in Prague who maybe had two. Like I didn't talk about Judas Priest here. I didn't talk about Iron Maiden here because they had two very strong guitar players to work with an amazing vocalist. So I'm talking about that 1-2 punch. Okay, and I think all the bands that I talked about, all the duos that I talked about here, embodied exactly what I'm talking about. Whereas that singer and that guitar player made magic, and together they became superstars and took that band to the next level because of their partnership. Whether they got along or didn't really matter, as long as they made the music happen and they made the concert experiences mind-blowing, because that's what it's all about, right? So anyway, visit us on the web at www.seaoftranquility.org. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, of course, we're here on the mighty YouTube. We've got a couple new shows coming up for you over the next couple days. I got a new product show, a lot of new CDs are coming out that I want to talk to you about, as well as I'm going to be doing that Deep Purple History of Career Retrospective imminently. So look for that over the next couple days. Till next time, be safe, enjoy your Memorial Day weekend, and I'll see you real soon.